about a creative change that's taking place.
The kind of change that we need to talk about most, and we haven't touched upon it, is a spiritual change. What kind of spiritual community do we want? And Mrs. Galambos did not help us at all with that. All she did was to shift the problem of our communities. Now, Mr. Alexander suggested that one of the things that bothers him, he sees that color difference is giving away to economic differences. And I think he's quite right about this. We're sort of getting over our color problem. Mr. Galambos was even willing to grant that we'd get some black folks out in Sandy Springs. But what she was not willing to talk about and to admit, that there ought to be some poor folks out there. And the other thing that bothers me about most of this discussion is, in the kind of affluent America which we have, we've taken it for granted that some folk got to remain poor. There's been no discussion here that we can eliminate poverty. We've assumed that some folk got to be poor, and we were condescending enough to say we'll let a few of them slip in out on the periphery somewhere, but not in Sandy Springs. Now this is absolutely, this to me, this is a kind of spiritual anemia, what is anemia, you know? Yeah, and myopia, which we've got to overcome in this country.
And Reverend Williams accuses me of saying that Sandy Springs ought to do this and ought to do that, I very carefully said, I am reporting on trends as I see them in Sandy Springs. And if you don't want to see those things, and if you want to keep putting your head in the sand and say, well, that's not the way it is, that's okay. But I'm trying to say, Reverend Williams, that there's no point in talking about what we ought to do in this country spiritually and what is morally right, that I'm a pragmatist, and I think we ought to think in terms of doing a little bargaining. And I think that's how political activity and progress comes everywhere, and that's how I watched it in Sandy Springs.
I think of Sandy Springs almost as a new town. And it's because when they've developed as super suburbs. I think that each town has to establish its own economic reason for being if you're going to get this economic mix. Because when you do that, then you're going to attract people into the area who are from different walks of life, who are of different economic backgrounds.